The first discussion topic on today's Peace and Prosperity is the issues surrounding the cost sharing of U.S. troops on the Korean Peninsula and subsequent concerns over a weakening of the South Korea-U.S. alliance. South Korea and the U.S. signed a mutual defense treaty in 1953 when the Korean War ended in an armistice. The treaty committed the two countries to provide mutual military aid if either faces armed attack. The treaty, which was the first of its kind for South Korea, also allowed the U.S. to station military forces and establish the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command in South Korea. South Korea, as a staunch U.S. ally, sent its troops to the Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan wars to support the U.S. despite criticism at home. Recently, there have been concerns over a possible weakening of the South Korea-U.S. alliance amid an impasse in negotiations on the cost sharing of U.S. troops in the South. Under the Special Measures Agreement, or SMA, South Korea is required to contribute to the cost of stationing U.S. troops in the country. The Trump administration has demanded a more than fivefold increase in South Korea's contribution to about $5 billion for next year. Speaking to reporters on December 3rd in London at the annual summit of NATO leaders, U.S. President Donald Trump stressed that Seoul should pay more, hinting at the possibility of reducing U.S. military presence in South Korea.
It can be debated. I can go either way. I can make arguments both ways. But I think I do think this. I think if we're going to do it, I think it's, they should burden share more fairly.
Trump's excessive demand has raised concerns at home, with a New York Times op-ed describing it as a lose-lose proposition. An op-ed piece in the Washington Post called it an insult that the South Korean government could never politically accept. The U.S. Senate also weighed in, praising South Korea's financial contributions to the alliance. It noted that South Korea spends about 2.5% of its GDP on defense, the highest figure among U.S. allies. The Senate also said the ongoing SMA negotiations should ensure mutual benefits and respect in recognition of South Korea's substantial cost-sharing commitments. The deadline for the negotiations is looming, as the existing SMA expires at the end of the month. Will the two allies be able to dispel concerns over a possible rift in the alliance and further cement their relations? To shed light on these latest developments, our host, Bong Young-sik, research fellow at Yonsei University's Institute for North Korean Studies, is joined by Kim Hyun-wook, professor at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. To broaden the perspective, we also connect with guest experts on Skype, including Harry J. Kazianis, Senior Director for Korea Studies at the Center for the National Interest, and Owen Miller, professor at SOAS University of London.
Hello and welcome to our program. Negotiations between South Korea and the U.S. on the cost sharing of American troops on the Korean Peninsula have hit a deadlock since Trump administration asks Seoul next year to pay 5 times what it currently pays. There are concerns in both South Korea and the U.S. that Washington's excessive demand could adversely affect the 66-year-old alliance. Joining us today to take a deep dive into these issues surrounding the defense cost-sharing negotiation between Seoul and Washington and the future of alliance between South Korea and the United States is Professor Kim Hyun-wook from the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.
My first question regards the remark by U.S. President Donald Trump at the NATO meeting that South Korea and Japan needs to pay more. No free riding of the U.S. allies must be allowed. What do you think of this timing and content of his remark?
Well, I think first thing is that, at this year's NATO meeting in London, finally President Trump persuaded many countries to raise their contribution to 2% of their GDPs. So pretty much successful. Of course, Germany is still hesitant, and still the countries that have completely agreed with Trump's proposal is only 5 countries. But I think it was much progress than before. So I think based upon this NATO meeting, I think President Trump is trying to, expand the targets of, pressure about the defense cost sharing issues, which I think Trump is thinking about the re-election next year. Because Iowa caucus is beginning in February, so sooner or later, in about 1 or 2 months, it will be a mainstream general election period in the United States. So Trump has to show to the people that he is really achieving America first. So I think that's one of the reasons that he is trying to make a lot of issues related to NATO meetings, including South Korea and Japan.
On the possible withdrawal or drastic reduction of U.S. forces stationed in South Korea, President Trump says that it's debatable. It's debatable, meaning that he's open to all the possibilities. What do you make of his remark?
I think that's a very typical way of President Trump's negotiation and pressure, so-called the negotiation through strength. I would say, which is pretty much similar to, peace through strength. Right. He always tried to use his power and strength to make the enemy to kneel down and win the negotiation with the enemy. So I think this is pretty much the typical way because South Korea is very much concerned about the possibility of U.S. forces in Korea to be dwindled or completely withdrawn back to the United States. Of course, the Congress is not agreeing with this kinds of idea. But nevertheless, the final decision is something to be made by President Trump, and he has the power to make all the decisions about the U.S. forces in Korea. So if he touches upon these issues, the U.S. forces in Korea withdrawal issues, I think this will be a very pivotal issue for the security of South Korea. And also, I think President Moon Jae-in's domestic political situation would be pretty much at risk because of the U.S. forces in Korea issues. So this is very sensitive issues, and he's touching upon it. So, maybe trying to use this as a very important bargaining chip to deal with South Korea on cost sharing issues.
Do you believe President Trump of the United States will listen to internal criticism? That, for instance, the New York Times and Washington Post call U.S. President Donald Trump's demand for cost-sharing hike from the allies outlandish and worrisome. Will these criticism at home affect his decision?
I think we have to think about what made President Trump to be re-elected as a president. That was because of the American people, public, to be wary of their own welfare and life patterns and life styles and levels. They think that after the 2008 global financial crisis, things have been much worse. The global economy got worse, and also in the United States, the middle class people are experiencing a bad economic situations, and they are criticizing outsiders, they're criticizing people who are immigrating into the United States. So President Trump has been using that issue very much to become a president. So I think he will stick on that issues. He will stick on, the issue that the U.S. is not working as a global policeman anymore, trying to make allies to pay for their defense by themselves. So the New York Times and Washington Post, articles criticizing President Trump, I don't think he would really care that much about that.
Because listening to the criticism will not really affect his chance to get re-elected, right? Okay. We will now connect with an expert in the United States to gauge local reaction to the issue. We have Harry Kazianis, Senior Director for Korea Studies at the Center for National Interest. Hello.
Thanks for having me. It was wonderful.
All right. The Trump administration has demanded that Seoul contribute nearly $5 billion to cover the cost of U.S. troops based in South Korea, which would be over 5 times what Seoul is paying now. This exceeds the entire cost of stationing U.S. troops in the South. How is the U.S. public reacting to Washington's demand?
Unfortunately, right now, the US public does not care about Korea, South Korea, or even North Korea. Right now, unfortunately, the US public is essentially completely obsessed with everything that's happening when it comes to Donald Trump's impeachment. So at the moment, all Korean issues are really, if they're getting into the pages of the Washington Post, the New York Times, it's very much the back pages. And that's only when North Korea essentially fires off a missile or does something provocative. So at the moment, the US public is not watching this issue. And this issue really has major ramifications for the US ROK alliance, but also our joint posture towards North Korea. And I really do think that we're not going to hear much about this, at least in terms of reaction from the American people, until impeachment is over. And that's a real shame.
Right, impeachment indeed. The second question is about the polls. Polls show that 7 in 10 South Koreans oppose a sharp increase in Seoul's contribution, even if it would mean a reduction of U.S. forces in the country. Do you think this defense cost sharing issue could possibly weaken the South Korea-U.S. alliance?
I do think in the long term, if this spat continues on and maybe there's no deal reached like was last year and it goes into February, I do think it puts a lot of unnecessary strain on the alliance. Now, I think Seoul probably saw this coming, and I think they've seen this coming if you even go back to last year. In fact, if you go back to the 2016 U.S. presidential campaign, one of the things that Donald Trump talked about consistently was burden sharing with allies. And many times he singled out South Korea, making the argument that South Korea's economy was a first-rate economy. They could afford to pay more for the U.S. alliance. But I think the problem here is it's the way that Donald Trump presents his argument. It almost like presents the U.S. ROK alliance as if it's some sort of gift to Seoul, as if Seoul hasn't sent combat troops around the world to protect the United States and pursue America's interests many times, not even Seoul's interests. And when you look at the pure amount of spending that the ROK spends on the alliance, the ROK is one of the best contributors to any alliance that the United States has. So I think in the long term, I think Donald Trump needs to be very careful. I think it is fair to ask for an increase, maybe even an increase of around 8% that was given by Seoul last year. But to ask for billions and billions of dollars extra, I think would be a huge mistake on the Trump administration's part. And I think the South Korean people are starting to question the fact that maybe we can deter North Korea on our own. And I think it would be a sad day if the alliance were to rupture.
What about the U.S. Congress? The U.S. Congress has recently said South Korea's substantial defense cost-sharing contributions should be respected. Do you think such acknowledgement by the Congress of the United States could affect defense cost-sharing talks between the two countries?
I think Congress getting involved is important, but I think over the long term, I think Donald Trump has it in his head that it was one of his campaign promises in 2016 to deliver greater amounts of cash for essentially these type of alliances. The problem with that is our allies in Seoul and Tokyo or in Brussels are going to start questioning U.S. foreign policy when it comes to these type of things. And I don't think that's something anybody wants at this point. So I think it's great that Congress gets involved. But I think we all know at the end of the day, the decision is going to be with President Trump. And I just hope he makes the right one.
All right. Harry Kazianis, Senior Director at the Center for National Interest. Thank you so much for sharing your insights today.
Awesome. Thanks as always for asking. I appreciate it. Take care.
Bye. Dr. Kim, any response to Kazianis' analysis of the situation?
Yeah, I think he delivered a very good atmosphere of the United States about the current cost-sharing issues. One thing I would like to add is that one of the important index that we can use to gauge which country contributes very much to the United States forces in their countries, I think there is some numbers that compares the GDP and also how much they contribute to the U.S. forces in those countries. In South Korean government's case, it's 0.068%, which means that South Korea is pouring that portion of their GDP into the maintenance of their U.S. forces in Korea. Mm-hmm. In case of Japan, it's 0.061%, lower than South Korean case. How about German case? It's only 0.016%, very, very low.
1/6.
Yeah, 0.016%.
Right.
So South Korea is contributing most highest level of their GDP into the U.S. forces maintenance in their countries compared to Japan and Germany. So I think we have to get all the materials when we negotiate and be very objective in our negotiation and let them know what is the situations that we are doing, because they have asked five times of money to be raised for the South Korean case and four times to be raised in case of Japan, and even that is not fair. So that's what I want to talk. And another thing that I would like to add is that I'm worrying about the United States with Trump government. It's not because it's facing the rise of China, but because the U.S. is not providing proper public goods to international community, which I think is a very important factor to be a hegemon state in global arena.
In principle, South Korea and the U.S. are supposed to wrap up negotiations for their defense cost-sharing deal or special measures agreement by the end of this month, when the existing agreement is scheduled to expire. Let's take a closer look at the SMA.
Under the Status of Forces Agreement signed in 1966, South Korea provided facilities and land for U.S. troops, while the U.S. paid all the necessary costs. But the U.S. asked for a new agreement in 1991 to make up for its huge military spending during the Gulf War. The Special Measures Agreement, or SMA, was initiated in 1991 to complement SOFA. Under the SMA, South Korea agreed to contribute to labor cost sharing and construction. Seoul's contribution, which began at $150 million in 1991, has risen to nearly $870 million in 2019. In the negotiations for the 11th SMA, the U.S. has reportedly called on Seoul to pay close to $5 billion, more than 5 times the amount agreed under the current deal, which expires this year.
I'm president of the United States. I'm not president of the world. They used our military to defend immensely wealthy nations, subsidizing their welfare states with your money.
South Korea and the U.S. do not see eye to eye on the subject of SMA negotiations. The U.S. argues that the agreement should address the cost of defending South Korea, while South Korea believes it should be limited to the cost of stationing U.S. troops in the South, as originally intended. South Korea maintains that it will make a reasonable and equitable financial contribution to the U.S., which includes personnel costs of South Korean workers hired by U.S. troops, military construction costs, and military assistance expenses. But the U.S. seeks to include additional cost categories to the agreement, including labor costs for the U.S. troops in South Korea, military personnel, and family support costs. The latest SMA, the 10th of its kind, is expected to expire at the end of the year. With no signs of progress in the negotiations, it remains to be seen what decisions the two allies will make.
It seems like in fashion these days that leaders talk about end of this year as a deadline, including Chairman Kim Jong-un. And supposedly the negotiations of the SMA is going to be concluded by the end of this year. Do you think it is likely or even possible for both sides, South Korea and the United States, to come up with an agreement on the defense cost sharing?
That's clearly the intention of the United States. The U.S. wants to finish negotiation and strike a deal by the end of this year. That's what it intends to make the deal about. But South Korea, there's a huge gap. U.S. wants the raise to be 500%,
right.
and we want only 4 or 5%
Right.
compared to the previous year. So there's a huge gap. And I think the South Korean strategy now is to drag the deal until sometime next year. And if there's no deal, there has been some article included on the last year's deal that if the deal is not made, 1 year can be, extended. The existing deal can be extended for 1 year. That was the deal that was made last year, if two parties agree about the extensions. And I think that's what South Korea wants. South Korea is thinking about the possibility of extending the last year's deal if this year if there's no deal this year.
So the 2019 agreement will be applied to 2020.
Sure.
Okay.
But the problem is that whether U.S. would agree upon the extension, that's first thing. I don't think U.S. would agree upon it. Second issue is if the deal is extended to next year, we have to think about how to pay for the Korean employees working in the U.S. forces in Korea. The salaries are paid by the U.S. forces. I don't think there's much way that Korean government can directly pay for their salaries. I'm not sure how to do that. If South Korean government is having some kinds of ways to pay for the salaries, I think extension is fine, and we can just drag the deal, even though there's no deal by sometime next year, because we cannot accept the 500% raise of the current cost sharing issues.
Now we'll hear observation from the UK. The UK is a member of NATO, or North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it is under pressure by the US to increase its contribution to the common budgets of the alliance. Joining us on the line is Owen Miller, professor at SOAS University of London. Hello?
Hello, thanks for having me on the show.
Our pleasure. The Trump administration has decided to cut its contribution to NATO collective budget. The other NATO members are expected to make up the shortfall. Any discomfort expressed by the UK or other NATO member about this?
I think in general, the establishment in the UK is quite unhappy and uncomfortable about this. Of course, we have a general election going on here at the moment, so who knows what the situation is going to be in a few weeks' time. But certainly, our current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is known to be on pretty good terms with Trump, although I suspect this is an issue that he doesn't agree with him on.
What do you make of Trump's view of the alliance, that if you want to keep the alliance, you need to pay more? How will this stance affect Washington's relations with its allies, in Europe especially?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. I think for a long time, U.S. relations with its allies have been very much based on these kind of liberal ideas of, promoting democracy. I mean, of course, during the Cold War, it was about standing up to the Soviet Union. Since the Cold War, it's been about things like the war on terror. It's been this kind of idea of a liberal alliance, which is in some sense, defending certain kind of way of life or freedoms, or, if you believe all these kind of things. But Trump seems to abandon that. I mean, to him, it just becomes a kind of transactional thing, right? It's just business, right? So it's simply a question that if he sees American troops being in another part of the world, then for him, I guess they're providing some kind of service, therefore they must be paid correctly for what they're providing. It's just purely a business transaction. And I think this is as we all know, this is a complete break from the way that US presidents have operated before. I mean, some people might say, well, Trump is just being more honest about what the Americans are doing, but obviously it upsets people. And I think it's going to have lasting effects on the alliances.
Okay, lasting effect on the alliance. Professor Owen Miller of SOAS University of London, thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you. It was nice to be here.
Dr. Kim, any response to Professor Miller's analysis?
I think in case of NATO, I think it was, I exactly remember the year, but they have agreed upon raising the defensive budget percent of GDP to 2%. But not many countries are willingly accepting that. Italy accepted it, and several countries have accepted it, but still Germany is unwilling to accept it. I mean, Prime Minister Merkel is saying that only Germany can accept the level of raising it to like a 1.6% instead of 2%, because our German economy is not very good now. Because current industry issues and economic issues is not very good. Have some Chinese money invested in Germany, but still, Chinese are trying to get some companies of Germany to be absorbed into China. So all these kinds of issues are making NATO countries unhappy about these issues. But as I have mentioned before, important thing is that the Trump government is making all the countries, all the allies and partners, rather than enemies like China and Russia, but all the allies and partners, enemies of the United States.
Right, that's irony, right?
Yeah, and if he's reelected in four years, what will be the U.S. status in the international community? That's what I'm worrying about.
Mm-hmm. Well, my last question for you regards that point. I'm worried if the turbulent negotiations on cost sharing may negatively affect security partnership between South Korea and the United States. Meaning that, Professor Kim, is ROK-U.S. security alliance safe?
Whenever I visit Washington, D.C., have meetings with experts, that's what I repeatedly mention to them. The America First is the biggest problem for the current U.S. alliance. I don't think the North Korea issue is a big problem. I mean, Trump agrees with it. Trump has been talking and dealing with Kim Jong-un, and also current Moon Jae-in government has been talking with Kim Jong-un. Of course, it's not going well, but still, I think as far as North Korea policy is concerned, I think the U.S. and South Korea is on the right common path right now. But the biggest issue, I think, is America First. I mean, we have been thinking of the U.S.-ROK alliance as something, bloodshed together, value-based, trust-based alliance that has been lasting for a long time. That, I think, has been very important, basis for the bilateral relationship. But Trump is only thinking of the alliance as a tool to get money out of South Korea. Maybe it's not only the case of South Korea; other countries might be in the same, case. But I'm worrying if Trump is reelected and same pattern of, getting money out of South Korea throughout the alliance mechanism continues. I think alliance will be in jeopardy. I think.
Right. Right, Dr. Kim Hyun-wook, thank you so much for sharing your analysis and insights with us.
Thank you very much.
And that is all we have for you today. We'll be back next week with more Korean Peninsula issues. Thanks for watching.